This is Heart Rhythm TV, and I am Julie Shea, here with another episode of Advancing Allies. Our topic for this episode is on EP provider burnout. And who better to have talk with me about this today than Dr. Sam Sears, who is a professor and researcher at East Carolina University in Greenville, North Carolina. So welcome, Sam. Thanks for
Julie.
Joining me today.
Pleasure to be here with you.
So you've done an immense amount of research on wellness for mental well-being for patients.
Right.
But today we need to talk a little bit about the providers, because we as providers, particularly coming off the pandemic, we're still dealing with being short-staffed or lack of access for patients getting in, and kind of the daily stressors of dealing with all of that. It takes its toll over time.
Absolutely.
Right? So can we talk a little bit about what is burnout and why is it important to address it?
Yeah, so burnout emerged over the last 25 years as kind of an occupational strain index. People are strained by their jobs, and burnout represents emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and reduced personal accomplishment. So that's the uniform definition with those three components. Okay. When you look across studies, whether it be general medicine all the way through cardiology, this one number emerges, 26%. Regardless of the sample size or the discipline focused on, about 26% of doctors and nurses report substantial burnout that interferes, interrupts care and their personal lives. So I think we have a concern here about how do we help healthcare providers build lives that are fun and interesting and energizing and recreating. And so that's really important, because this is a long game.
It is, yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
Healthcare is a long game. We've got our personal lives, our clinical lives, and our society depends on us being healthy and being empathic and effective. And burnout gets in the way of that.
No, absolutely. I mean, how can we care for our patients if we can't even care for ourselves, right? So what's known about cardiologists and APPs about burnout and mental health issues?
Yeah, I think what we know is that it's there, and it's been there. And going back to even pre-COVID data all the way to current COVID or post-COVID data, you get this 26% number. But there's also some data from WebMD surveys that suggest that particularly cardiology is quite unhappy outside of work and quite unhappy at work. So there's something about cardiology too, not just EP. We know a lot less about EP as a subspecialty, but within cardiology, there seems like there's some elements to this aspect of the profession that make it harder. I don't know if it's curbside consults. I don't know if it's call. The 24-hour service demands. I don't know if it's remote monitoring demands. I mean, just collectively, the relative occupational burden of managing cardiovascular disease in its full spectrum by a full spectrum of providers is quite demanding.
Yeah, it's overwhelming.
Yes.
It's very overwhelming at times. So what are some practical solutions to help with self-care and maintaining kind of this work-life balance that you just brought up?
I really like the idea of humble awareness of our limits. The people in healthcare, we're used to succeeding. There aren't that many. When you look back on our lives, I mean, we're used to getting good grades. We're used to succeeding in most ways. And so suddenly to encounter the limits of our own physical and mental endurance is a humbling process. And some people try to ignore that it's happening. But the reality is that we are limited, and humble awareness means, hey, I want to build a life that's meaningful and worth living. I think we have a great chance as healthcare providers. What we do is meaningful, honorable even. It's energizing to make a difference for other people. So it's curious that the very people that get to do that get so worn out from it. And that's because I think our systems are not particularly supportive of the humans that are in it. I think our systems are demanding about stretching our our efforts, stretching our capacities without necessarily recognizing that temporarily stretched is one thing, but when that becomes the norm, which I think you, as you noted, post-COVID has become the norm.
Right. I mean, look at a rubber band. You keep stretching it, it breaks, right, eventually. So,
and I think we want to get back to this idea that we note this 26% of burnout, but other data says that only about 10% are finding joy in their work. Now you go, well, that's kind of silly. How naive, be joyful at work. But there is a joy to work. Doing meaningful work that makes a difference for people, that should bring joy. So I want to get us back to that. And my lab, we're starting to look at ways that we can collect data about the EP workforce across the board, all people that take care of EP patients, so that we can start to intervene in ways, not just keep saying 26% are burned out. Okay, I'm over that. Let's talk about what are the things that systems can do to support the human beings. I mean, these are very traditional occupational psychology and occupational management challenges. EP's grown up now. You and I used to go to NASP.
That's right.
This is grown up now, so we got to get smarter about how we're going to build sustainable workforces for the long run. And I think both you and I really want that. We want to see our younger peers and colleagues thrive and sustain success.
So in terms of like self-care things, like what can people do? What are ways that people can help with better self-care?
Yeah. The simple question across all the studies is exercise. Okay, so the most busy people are healthcare providers. I mean, for gosh sake, we have an 80-hour rule for fellows. What profession has an 80-hour rule, right? But exercise is the universal ointment, but that's not possible for everyone. From a psychological standpoint, I think validation really matters. Being able to have peers or loved ones who can validate the experience in order to achieve less isolation. I think that we as healthcare providers suffer in isolation somewhat and lack that opportunity to validate each other sometimes. And particularly as we get pressed, there's less opportunity to have a cup of coffee and say, hey, how's it going? Boy, that was a tough case that we went through. That we have grief together. And so that doesn't always happen. So to me, it's exercise, validation, reduce isolation through support. And I think at some point to build activities in our lives, quality of life activities, like we ask our patients to do. Like, hey, what do you love to do? You want to go see the Red Sox?
Joyful.
Oh, it's, we got to go to the stadium. It's a lot of work. Yeah, but when you get there, it's going to be great. Oh, we got to park too far away. Yeah, but when we get there, it's going to be great. So I think there are barriers to the things that we love to do that we have to overcome sometimes. So I think those are the key things to building a not just an anti-burnout life, but a meaningful, generative, creative work and life.
Work-life balance, yeah. And one of the things that you brought up was communication, right?
Yeah.
Why communication is so important. And, when should EP providers seek out help if they're really struggling with burnout? I mean, they think, obviously, self-realization that you are in a burnt-out state and that you do need some help, but can you...
Yeah, I mean, I think there are absolute indications, things like life not feeling like worth living, thoughts about self-injurious kinds of ideas and thoughts. I mean, those are incredibly important, that those are absolute indications. But the relative indications are much more subtle. Right. Things like not being energized to come to work. Things like difficulty getting along with other coworkers. Things like missing the opportunities to recognize the successes and meaningfulness of our work. When we get ground down and we don't have some of that generative energy, that creative opportunity, and being valued by that, I think those are more subtle or relative indications for things. I think anxiety and depression, obviously, but I'm trying to get at more of the sort of normative things that are not necessarily of a diagnostic, but are experiences or symptoms that get in the way of being the best we can be. I try to think about, am I putting my best self out there? And when I look and I say, that's not my best self, then something's wrong. Because I know I meant to. And I think that often says, okay, we need to let's unplug a little bit and let's do a little bit of self-reflection. I love the old Taylor Swift song. She says, I'll stare directly at the sun, but never in the mirror. Yeah. Well, I mean, it kind of fits for the doggone heart rhythm folks sometimes. It's like, hey, I'll tell you all about all this other important science, but I don't really want to have that self-reflection. I don't want to turn the microscope to my own health, and I think that's where
so much
it's hard.
The nature of who we are.
Yeah,
as healthcare.
And actually, we can actually camouflage not doing that. I got to take care of these people, and then never really say, wait a second. Yeah. Extending yourself, rubber band, as you said. Yeah. There's a limit. We are limited. We're not forever.
Yeah, and I think one of the great takeaways from today is that self-reflection, taking the few minutes to kind of think about where you are in your life and what's good and what's not good and what things where you may need to pivot in your life, right? Yeah. And try to make things better for you.
Once again, Taylor Swift finding its way into our daily life when she's inescapable these days.
Absolutely. I think certainly professional development, coming to these meetings, one of the big things that not only networking, seeing friends, I always say it's like a college reunion, right?
Yeah, it is.
And the reinvigoration that we find through continued professional development and seeing people who are going through the same thing that you are, I think is...
Yeah, I agree with you. I didn't quite think of it that way, but I do think there is something to that. And I think almost to the point where since we see each other once a year, we can actually follow up on how things are going. And some of those are major family events or personal events, and you go, oh, you made it through.
Right.
Without necessarily knowing every detail of the process that the outcome happened. But there is that reconnection, and I think that reduces that isolation I talked about that I think is common in healthcare.
Absolutely.
There's very few people that can understand what we do every day. It's like, so you give people devices that save their life? Yeah, we do that every day. And that there's just not a lot of people that can walk up and agree with you about that.
It's just like one big support group meeting.
Yeah, well, maybe it is. Maybe that's what we need to do. It's certainly great for those of us that have been doing this a long time to connect. So Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here with you, Julie.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. This is Julie Shea for Heart Rhythm TV.